from a defabricated garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA. This is Stand Up with Pete Dominick. On today's episode, the trials and tribulations of animal companion tapeworms. And now, the podcast host who keeps those tapeworms at bay with the most advanced intestinal health technology, Pete Dominick.
Thank you, Pete Co., for yet another outstanding introduction, and hard to follow that, but I would recommend that folks have a bowl of colon blow every morning. Look it up. It's an old SNL sketch. Hello, my friends. How are you? I'm checking in. I'm asking how you're doing. How's your practice? Do you have a practice? I like that word. Who wants to make fun of me for using that word? Meet me at the Hangout on Thursday night if you do. I have been mostly alone for the last 17 days because Val took the girls to Sicily to see her family there, and I've gotten a lot done, a lot of work on myself, working my own practice, meditating, reading, and writing. Several of you have reached out to ask me about that, so I'll do a little Q&A on what's working for me, and I'd love to hear what works for you on Thursday night at the Hangout. I will be with my friends Ophira Eisenberg and Christian Finnegan tomorrow night in Ventnor City, New Jersey. Tickets in the show links. If you want to see us in Southern Jersey, I would love to meet you. Excited to see my friend Mark Lipsky there tomorrow night. He's coming. Who else? Today, I've got two really great guests, great conversations with both Robbie Jones, Professor Robbie Jones, and Dave Rothkopf, who is always excellent. And I am taping this Tuesday morning, the 12th, and at 1 p.m. East today, the January 6th committee is going to be meeting. I'll have comedians Jay Black and Noel Kasler, as I have a couple times before, live during the recess and after for jokes and analysis on what transpired in the hearings on Tuesday. So join us there as well. So much happening in the world. As always, we'll talk about that, and we will talk about what's happening in your heart and soul and family and community each and every day here on Stand Up. I will have two guests to help us work it all out, and I am just so appreciative and grateful that you are on the journey with me as well. Did I mention my gratefulness journal? I've heard a lot about that. Val taught me about that after I lost my gig, and I've heard a lot of people talk about it, smart folks like Val talk about it, and in the subsequent time period, and it's nothing new, but I guess I never really thought about it. It works. Write down what you're grateful for each and every day. Try it for like 30 days. I promise you, it makes a difference. It sounds cheesy, but it really works. Anyway, we'll talk about that and everything else to improve your life, to make things better, to navigate the suffering, the painful moments, and share the joy, happiness, and have some laughs along the way. Thank you for being a part of this community and listening to this podcast. If you haven't signed up for a paid subscription, hey now, what are you waiting for? StandUpWithPete.com right now. Okay, well, Robbie Jones is the author of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, as well as the End of White Christian America. He is the president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. And Robbie Jones joins me after my conversation with Dave Rothkopf, who has had a life, folks. He told me he used to manage theaters for like 10 years at the beginning of his career, but he's worked in presidential administrations. He's worked on foreign policy. He ran Foreign Policy magazine. He is now a columnist at The Daily Beast and the host of Deep State Radio, an awesome podcast. And there's a whole bunch of other podcasts over at Deep State Radio. His, the Rothkopf Group, media group. But Dave is just great. I love Dave. He's got a dry but hilarious and very, very sharp sense of humor. He's one of the most well-connected guys, I think, in the country when it comes to politics, government, and, well, pretty much everything. If you want to meet or talk to somebody, you probably should call Dave Rothkopf. He's awesome on Twitter, where I love following him and reading his threads at DJ Rothkopf. And he's here right now for all of us. Hi, is Dave there? Remember that?
Yes, I do.
You call up somebody and ask them if they were there, and now nobody. Do you ever cold call anybody, Dave Rothkopf? Does anybody ever just call you if you saw somebody that even that was a good friend of yours calling you? Wouldn't you be like, "What are you doing?"
The only reason to call somebody is if there's an emergency.
Right.
And that's what I assume. I assume if my phone is ringing, it's an emergency or you're 90.
Right. Because Only the olds, the very olds, are still stuck to a landline or a traditional phone. They don't want to touch a screen.
Right. And most normal people would rather text or email anyway.
I was listening to some of your recent podcasts. You have a whole plethora at your amazing media company, Deep State Radio, and you have a wide range of folks, both ethnically and ideologically and generationally, even a podcast for kids. My question to you is, how have you adapted to new technology? You're excellent on the social media. You're great on Twitter. You're very good at it. But I heard you say that your daughters put you onto it when you had a book coming out. Like you went involuntarily into the void of Twitter?
Well, I mean, I guess that was like 12 years ago or something. But my one of my daughters was sitting there and a book was coming out and she said, you should be on Twitter. And I was like, okay. And, within weeks, she was like, you should be off Twitter. You should stop doing this. And now she has taken a very public position where she only does private tweets. She looks down on me for being involved in this mayhem of, sort of broader Twitter.
I love it. That's very funny. I want to talk with you about some very serious issues. As always, Dave, get your take. You've been excellent, of course, at the Daily Beast, your podcast, on Twitter, as I just said. But I was particularly, is that how you pronounce the word, interested in, I want to start with your piece at the Daily Beast. Put a fork in Donald Trump. The ex-president is done. Everybody should go subscribe to the Daily Beast to read the thing. But Dave, go ahead and try to make the case. Try to convince me and all of the doubters.
Well, sure. I mean, in no particular order. Donald Trump is old. He's fat. He's losing it. That ought to be enough. He's known to be a felon and a sex abuser and the most corrupt president in history. That ought to be enough. But as we've discovered, none of those things are enough.
Right.
But the January 6th hearings have had an interesting effect. They've changed poll standing for the GOP. That the combination of the January 6th hearings and the Dobbs decision reversing Roe v. Wade. And so Dem prospects have grown. And at the same time, in sort of head-to-heads among Republicans, although Trump remains the leader, DeSantis is gaining ground. And of course, what you've also seen is within the context of the Trump White House, more and more people being willing to speak out, whether it's Cassidy Hutchinson or it's most recently the former White House counsel, Pat Cipollone. And I think that is a sign that people are less afraid of Donald Trump. Now, that, by the way, is not to say they're not afraid of his supporters. I saw something on Twitter today saying Cassidy Hutchinson has got security and is in hiding because of the fact that they contain a large component that are really just a bunch of animals. But, Trump has no ideology. He's got a lot of defects. The reason that Republicans held their nose and sort of said, okay, we'll back this dude is because they thought it was going to help him win. And if they think he's not, then they're moving away from him. And I think that's what's happening now. Now, I don't breathe a sigh of relief when I think Ron DeSantis is going to be the next president of the United States because, he's a kind of full-on fascist. And I understand, and, there are Florida school districts where you can't put up a rainbow sign because, of the don't say gay legislation. Yeah. I mean, the place is a horror show. But I think Trump's influence from now forward will only decline.
When does Dave Rothkopf sigh a breath of relief? When do you do that these days, given the news? You must do it. You must have your practice where you find joy, where you relax. You don't worry. Knowing what you know, you don't worry.
5,000 years of Jewish history means never. But the reality is, I think we're in for 20 really, really tough years in the U.S.
Great.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to make you feel bad, but the reality is that as we move from country that has traditionally been a country dominated by white men to a country which is a minority and majority country, which will be in sort of 2043, according to the Census Bureau. There's going to be a period of big pushback. And during that period, we are also going to see the Republican Party push for more and more ways to institutionalize minority rule. Some of them are in the Constitution. You get, in the Senate by 2030, 70 seats in the Senate will represent just 30% of the U.S. population. But others have to do with things like the Supreme Court, which is now considering a case which may transfer to the states a huge ability to determine the outcome of elections and further erode democracy and make it so that you don't have a debate about the 2020 elections. They'll just be automatically stolen. And so, until all that is reversed, and I ultimately think it will be because of demographic changes and the obvious corruption associated with it, we're going to be in for a really, really hard time of a minority, but white men, and particularly white Christian men, desperately trying to cling to power.
So I'll be okay, is what I heard.
Yeah, did I say that to you? You should be, as a pillar of the media and a man with enormous influence.
You mentioned the Supreme Court. I was going to ask you about that. I was listening to Deep State Radio, a great conversation about it. I love Ed Luce. It's not just because of his accent, but I have said before, and I'll say it again, if you both said the same thing, I would believe him more. He said that something about, he's a world traveler of sorts, I guess. I don't know much about him, but I'm a big fan. And he had just gotten back from Europe and he'd been around and a lot about, obviously, the Middle East. And he kind of compared today's Supreme Court makeup to Iran's kind of Supreme Council and the way that the judges had influence there. He talked about theocracy. You mentioned Clarence Thomas and the fact that, Clarence Thomas now looking at not only overturning women's reproductive rights, but maybe contraception, and let's look at gay marriage, and let's look at gay sex as well. Do you think that comparison to a kind of theocratic council of justices is accurate, or is it hyperbolic? Is it too much?
Well, I think it's intentionally hyperbolic, but there's enough accuracy in it to, make it an effective way of making a point. This group of justices represents a tiny minority view. 2/3 of Americans did not want Roe versus Wade overturned. Up to 90% of Americans want to see certain basic gun controls that this Supreme Court does not support. An issue, 2/3 of Americans would like to see more environmental protections, and they struck down the ability of the Environmental Protection Agency to do the kind of regulation that's necessary to keep us from further destroying the planet. They represent a minority of Americans and views that are contrary to the majority of Americans, and they are able to hand them down for the rest of their lives without fear of contradiction, particularly since the only way to undo much of what they are saying or doing is to either amend the Constitution, which ain't never going to happen, right? Because you need, whatever it is, the supermajority of the states to ratify it, or get a law passed. And frankly, we're heading into an election in which it increasingly looks like Republicans might take back the House. Yeah. And if Republicans take back the House, forget it. There's not going to be any progress. In fact, we're going to be bogged down in show hearings, that'll be, make Benghazi look like the height of judicial responsibility. And right. So we're going to be in a bad situation. And so, you've got a bunch of old white guys in robes plus Clarence Thomas, whose wife actively participated in sedition. And they hand down irreversible rulings that serve the interests of a tiny minority of Americans.
And Amy Coney Barrett, what do you want to? What category?
Amy Coney Barrett, that's right. But she represents a group that, she's been part of groups that sort of promote the subordination of women's views to those of their husbands.
You also recently wrote about the court, a couple articles, The Beast, separation of church and state is crumbling before our eyes, and then the Supreme Court trying to turn back the clock 200 years. What do you want to say about those cases, the conclusions that they came on the two religion cases of funding religious schools in Maine and praying at a football game? Do you pray? How do you feel about praying in public, much less in the middle of after you've coached a bunch of young kids to a triumph, Dave?
America was founded by a lot of people who left Europe that had been shattered by bloodshed as a result of religious conflicts for hundreds of years. Intolerance, whether it was in Great Britain or elsewhere. And, it was a very important point for the founders of the country to say that there should be no establishment of a state religion, right? The Establishment Clause is in the Constitution. And people, with some credibility, like James Madison, who actually wrote the Constitution, talked about a wall separating religion and the state, which he thought was important because what it would do is not only protect the impartiality of the state, but it would keep religions from being corrupted by the state. And, you take the first of the two cases that you mentioned, and in it, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Maine, if they were giving people money, so because they had to go to a private school because there was no public school available to them, they had to allow that to go to religious schools. Well, what's the next step? The state determines who can receive, which religions can receive state money and which can't. Somebody's going to come along and say, well, I want to use that to go to a radical madrasa, and this group is going to say, no, you can't.
Right.
Or they're going to say, well, I want to do this to go and be part of some Orthodox Jewish sect, or, some religion that people don't take seriously.
Mormons.
Pardon me?
Mormonism.
But I was thinking of what is that one, flying spaghetti monsters or whatever, there are these various small sects, and does the United States then say, no, you're not a religion, you are a religion.
Right.
That's how you corrupt religion. And then, this dude who goes to the middle of the field after the game and kneels down in prayer, and then, he encourages, his team to do it, and people from other teams do it. And the Supreme Court's like, well, they don't really have to do it. And it's like, well, if your coach is kneeling down in prayer and the rest of your teammates are doing it, are you against the team? Are you against the coach? Are you against God? And, the teenagers don't work that way. And, it was so egregious that in her dissent, Justice Sotomayor included a picture of the crowd at of football players kneeling in the center of the field to disprove the argument of the Supreme Court justices who were, Gorsuch and whomever were advocating this thing. And within it, there was even, they have gone back and said, despite the fact that they're allegedly strict constructionists, that what should guide in these decisions are tradition and history. Well, most of the tradition and history of the United States is tinged with division, racism, sexism, and other kinds of things. And so those are kind of bad metrics and markers. So I strongly believe separation of church and state was a good idea when Madison advanced it. It remains a good idea, but this Supreme Court doesn't agree. And they're tearing it down in ways that we just never would have thought possible.
It's like you say, Trump is gone, but you also acknowledge his legacy endures in no more than the three justices he got on the court. I don't even know if it's...
No, I mean, Amy Coney Barrett could be a justice on the Supreme Court. I mean, when was Clarence Thomas appointed? 1989 something like that. So that was 34 years ago. So Amy Coney Barrett's going to be there 30 years from now. In 2052, we're going to be getting, pearls of wisdom from this woman. So, or Kavanaugh, could be around for that period of time. And, with modern medical science, longer.
Right. Do you eat at Morton's?
And not since I moved out of Washington, but I think that's a reference to Justice Kavanaugh eating at Morton's.
No, I was just about to do a live read for Morton's, but
if you want
to step on it,
Supreme Court justices eat here. They love our steaks, and so do protesters.
I like the argument my friend Mara Quint made to me yesterday here on the podcast was abortion is inherently about privacy. And if he's going to overturn the privacy of all women, then I don't think it's that big of a deal that we're going to bug him when he's at a steakhouse. Do you agree with that?
I think peaceful demonstration is fine. If they menace somebody, that's not fine. If they threaten somebody, that's not fine. Should he expect to glide through life comfortably while he reverses fundamental rights of the majority of the population? Hell no. He and others, who, promote allegedly free speech and condemn cancel culture, want to cancel anybody who is, anti their point of view or want to silence them. And I think that's nonsense. And, this right to privacy thing is what leads back to what you were talking about earlier. To the extent to which they assert you don't have a right to privacy, they're essentially going to open the door, as Clarence Thomas said in his concurrence to the Dobbs decision, to regulating contraception, regulating gay sex, regulating gay marriage, and by regulating, I mean prohibiting. And, should we just sort of sit there and say, yes, sir, please, sir, may I have some more? Fuck no.
I want to ask you about January 6th committee. I guess I'll try to get this out to subscribers earlier, but our conversation here will be posted on Tuesday, and probably a lot of people will hear it after the committee hearing. But, how significant, you've talked about this a lot and tweeted about it. How significant was Cassidy Hutchinson? Do you think it led to Trump's White House, is it lawyer, Pat Cipollone? I don't care how it's pronounced. And do you think her 26-year-old, who you mentioned now has security and probably will have somebody chasing her the rest of her life, but she'll probably get a corporate gig or speaking fees or a book deal too for her bravery. But does a 26-year-old woman's courage open the door for an old white guy, Cipollone, and how much of a difference does his testimony make, do you think?
I think to anybody who is seeking to understand what happened on January 6th and to make a judgment based on the facts, the testimony of the White House counsel, particularly a White House counsel who actively defended Trump against impeachment, who continues to be loyal to Trump in certain ways, to assert executive privilege, where none exists because of the crime fraud exception. And by the way, as the White House counsel, he's not the president's lawyer, right? He's the lawyer for the people of the United States in the White House. So his responsibility is to the Constitution, not to the president. And he's been playing a little bit cute on all of that stuff. But to the extent to which somebody like that comes out and says Cassidy Hutchinson was telling the truth, which is apparently what he said, that's real significant.
Yeah.
To the extent, given that one of the things she said was that he said that, the president shouldn't follow through on his plans with regard to January 6th because he would be breaking all sorts of laws. That's significant. And, if there were any sort of justice in the United States of America, facts like that would lead to the prosecution and conviction of the former president of the United States.
Right.
Now, I'm not sure there will, but it should.
Finally, Dave Rothkopf, you have come out strongly in support of the idea that Democrats, progressives, people who care about democracy as a new category should coalesce behind the idea of a Kamala Harris presidency. Interesting to hear you talking about that. I hadn't really thought about it yet, but I guess it's time. I guess it's time to talk and think about it. Why are you making the case for the vice president to take the reins?
Well, actually, I mean, I sort of made that case. Essentially, what I'm a single issue voter at this point.
Yeah, democracy.
Democracy, right? Yeah. And how do you preserve democracy? And there is one party in the United States, the Republican Party, that is seeking to erode and undermine democracy. They are against it. So I'm with the pro-democracy party,
right?
Who happen to be called, conveniently enough, the Democrats. Now, if the Democrats run Joe Biden, then that's who I'll support. If Joe Biden doesn't run, then I would prefer it that the Democrats not get into a food fight with each other and undermine the chance that they're going to win the next election. Who is the best successor? Well, Joe Biden has said the successor should be Kamala Harris. Jim Clyburn, who was sort of the kingmaker behind Joe Biden, said the successor should be Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is the first woman, the first woman of color, the first person of color to be the vice president of the United States. She's accomplished a great deal. She's intelligent. She's hardworking. She has been victimized by absolutely constant attacks in the press, not because she's doing a bad job, but because people are afraid that she will gain momentum and become the heir apparent.
Right.
So first and foremost, I'm for whoever will help us preserve democracy in the United States. And as it stands right now, that's Joe Biden first. And if it's not Joe Biden, it's Kamala Harris. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is the Democrats stay unified and focus on getting people out to vote in November and in 2024 who will fight the fight for democracy. And that includes young people. Now, just the final point, there have been a bunch of polls. There was a New York Times article over the weekend, which have said that, a lot of Democrats have some doubts about Biden. And in particular, something like 90% of voters under 30 have doubts about Joe Biden. That's a serious problem. And I think the president and the White House, Kamala Harris, the whole party need to figure out what they've got to do to get young people to turn out. Because if young people voted proportionally the way that older generations do, Democrats would win in a landslide.
Across the board, all the way down to local elections is my experience, for sure. Yeah. In a lot of ways. I said that was the last, but I got to ask you, because you're the man on this. The president's headed to Middle East. He's going to Israel. He's going to Saudi Arabia. Why? Can he accomplish anything?
I think he can accomplish quite a bit. I think he's going to get no credit. I think it's a very sort of bold and risky trip because, he's going to go there and people are going to say, well, did the price of gas come down? And it's not going to come down. This trip isn't going to be able to achieve that. They'll say, did you tell Mohammed bin Salman that, he's out of the world system because he killed Jamal Khashoggi? And that's not going to happen. He's actually going to have to deal with them. Is he going to stand up to American friends in the region who've turned their back on Ukraine? No, he's going to try to persuade them. This is what's, known in the business as old-fashioned diplomacy, where you go, you take risks, you realize you're not going to get any credit with the public for your successes. You realize that you may get some brickbats, but you do it because you got to do it. Because we have allies in the region, and interests in the region, and friends in the region, and some fair weather friends in the region. And we need to go and look them in the eye and advance our goals, whether it's support Ukraine, pump gas so we lower the price of gas, or, help us contain the threat of Iran, or, hey, Israel, why don't you move towards a two-state solution? And a lot of the tough and most important conversations are going to take place in the background. And a lot of the media coverage you're going to see is going to be, oh my God, he didn't get this, or, oh my God, this was awkward. And, but I do think that in the region, they're going to say, he went, got on a plane, he came to see us, he looked us in the eye, he said what he thought, And we are going to be better off with regard to our national interests after this trip than we were before.
Well said. Thank you so much, Dave, for explaining all of your points of view on these very important, consequential issues that are happening in our country and beyond. I highly recommend, whenever I interview Dave, I always listen to Deep State Radio ahead of time, and he does how many episodes of your show and then a bunch of other shows under your umbrella?
I think we do 2 to 3 episodes of Deep State Radio a week, but we also have Words Matter. We have the show that we do with the sort of foreign policy thinkers under 30. We've got
love it, love that.
A whole bunch of other things. I guess we're doing 6 or 7 podcasts a week
now. So go listen to all those podcasts. But I'm not worried about the Jews replacing me, because there's plenty of podcasts to go around, and people shouldn't be racist. But you should listen to. Actually, you might need to.
I've always sort of tried to have both sides of this thing. As the son of a Holocaust survivor, somebody grew up Jewish in the United States. One of the early things I did, you have to go back to your first question, the early days of the internet.
Yeah.
Was I bought the domain name worldjewishconspiracy.com.
You did?
Because I did. And I own that. And my thought was that, look, if somebody's going to go and look up who is in charge of worldjewishconspiracy.com and they see my name, you know what I'm saying? It's going to increase my influence a lot. And I also thought there was probably a whole thing of T-shirts and things I could do. I've never really capitalized on that. But
Did any of the other domain names that you bought do anything for you? Did you make any money?
I have a kind of weird. I probably have 40 or 50 domain names that I control, and it just makes me feel good to have them. Some people collect stamps. Actually, nobody even remembers what collecting stamps are, right?
I do.
That was a thing.
Yeah, you said stamps, coins, and other collectible type stores and shows, and I was in the baseball card category, so I'd always see those stamp and coin people, which I thought weren't as cool.
Me too. I had these shoe boxes full of great baseball cards, all of which would be worth a fortune. And my mother gave them away. I went to college. I came back. Where are the baseball cards? Oh, I gave them away.
Yeah, well, I because of those cards that you're talking about, the 50s and the 60s probably, I started collecting in the 80s thinking they would be an investment, and none of them are worth hardly anything. All of the baseball, football cards from the 80s are worth about, the same, almost nothing.
No, mine are mostly 60s and 70s. Right. We're 60s and 70s. But yes.
Well, it's ironic that you had the foresight to invest in all those domain names, but you couldn't get your own name on Twitter. You're DJ Rothkopf. Do you hate that guy?
I don't even know that I tried to get David Rothkopf on Twitter. I think I just went. DJ Rothkopf was the email handle I had. So I just used it.
Well, I don't know who this imposter Dave Rothkopf is, but I like.
Oh yeah, no, there are a bunch of imposters out there now, and on Instagram too. And it's holy shit, man! How empty can your life be if what you're trying to do is be an imposter of a nobody like me? Great, well, sure, have at it.
That I'll just say that means that my life is pretty empty because I have been an imposter for my entire career. So you can judge all you want.
I wrote a book on one of the books I wrote was on the history of the NSC. And I remember vividly having a conversation with Madeleine Albright, and we started going off into a bunch of directions. And she said, we all have imposter syndrome. He said, we sit in cabinet meetings and we all look around the room and we think to ourselves, I don't belong here. Are they going to discover that I don't belong here? And I thought it was so insightful to me because we all think when we're growing up that, people get up onto these sort of Olympian heights and they all are sort of leaders who expect to lead. And the reality is everybody in the room doesn't think they belong there. And the ones who do are jerks.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Not everybody. It's the smart ones, the ones with credibility and respect are the ones that you would have that would feel that way.
And to me, this is one of the punchlines in the book, which I think actually The Economist or somebody mentioned it in the review, is that these meetings, in the Situation Room at the height, you look around the table and it's like being in high school. They're all the same jerks you went to high school with, and it's like, oh my God, the world is being run by the jerks that I went to high school with. And yeah, and every other sort of faction. And it's one of the most sort of perspective wrenching moments in your life when you all of a sudden realize, no, there are almost none of the great figures of history that you think, are out there someplace. They're just people like the ones you went to high school with.
I don't know. I see that picture, that famous photograph the night that Obama's administration went after bin Laden. That's what I think of when I think of Situation Room. I suppose you've been in it yourself, but those people, there's a lot of smart people in there, right? That
were smart people, and and qualified people, and earnest people. But it doesn't mean they aren't people without insecurities and flaws and pettiness and silliness and weird senses of humor. I used to go this was the Clinton administration, and I would drive to these early morning meetings in the Situation Room on whatever subject it was when I was in the Clinton administration. And I remember driving there and thinking, am I the only one going to this meeting who's listening to the Howard Stern show before I'm going to,
That is amazing. Well, someday I'd love to just tape an interview with you talking about the things you've seen and experienced in your career. I think it would be really seriously fascinating. All right, I'll let you go, but before I do, you've been talking. I keep trying to let you go. Say something about Mark Meadows, because we're talking about the imposters, and you've been talking a lot about him. And January 6th, what based on the reporting, what kind of person is Mark Meadows? He seems like probably the worst actor of them all for some reasons.
Well, he's a bad actor. There are a lot of bad actors there, and most of them are there because they were motivated by ambition and because they had no values. Yeah. And he sort of epitomizes that. He was a sort of lousy member of Congress, an empty suit, and he goes there. And the reason he is picked, and this is sort of high Trump, he's the fourth Trump White House chief of staff. And that's, Trump finally achieves his goal in his third or fourth iteration in a lot of these jobs of hiring people primarily, exclusively, actually, because they will say yes to Trump. Yes. And Meadows sits there and does it. Although I was reading somewhere over the past couple of days that somebody essentially said, Mark Meadows kind of had a nervous breakdown around
I saw
January
that too.
6th.
Yeah, Mick Mulvaney said it. His previous chief of staff, I think, is what I said.
Yeah. Maybe it was Mick Mulvaney, who was a terrible chief of staff also.
Person, yeah.
Yeah. But, he said you listen to Cassidy Hutchinson, and she goes in and literally democracy is ending. She walks into the White House chief of staff's office, which is like the big corner office in the White House. After the Oval Office, it's the big office. And he's sitting on the couch, scrolling on his phone. And she talked about that. And I was like, what a weirdo. And he doesn't even look up,
Is it true that he snapped and screamed, "I'm doing Wordle"? Is that true? Or is that just a rumor?
Yeah, words with friends too. No, but I think the reality is this. Trump locked himself in his room. Yeah. Said, I don't want to be bothered. Yeah. And Meadows sort of knew the world was collapsing. And I think he knew that the next time he heard from Trump, it would be on Twitter. And I think he was scrolling through Twitter, waiting to see what the instructions were from the Twitterer in chief, and realizing that he was either A, completely impotent, or B, had no desire whatsoever to go and challenge the president and say, by the way, boss, you're destroying democracy. You're going to go to jail. Don't do this.
Someone should write a book or an article aggregating how many times people in the administration learned of their orders through public media.
I have a book coming out in
when is your book?
In the fall, called American Resistance, which is about how people in the Trump administration managed Trump and managed to keep things from being worse than they were. And I'm writing this book in part because there were a lot of people who were in the administration. You may not agree with them on a lot of political things, but who actually stopped wars, insane conflicts, COVID from getting worse, the immigration bans from getting worse and stuff. And they did it all behind the scenes. But, one of the things, I interviewed 100 people for the book, and one of the things that you hear from these people is they would get their marching orders from Twitter. They would get, there would be, whispers as people tried to figure out what Trump really believed. Right. And it was, even at this point, in the midst of the January 6th hearings, I think it is fair to say, based on having done all the research for this book, that we have no idea how bad it was. We're just scraping the surface of what an insane, and by the way, right, this is a corrupt, rapist, lying president who worked for a foreign enemy who threw plates of ketchup at the wall, right? And that's not as bad as it gets. I think it gets much worse than that.
You can pre-order American Resistance right now, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. It won't be available till November 1st. I'll try to convince the publisher to send me an advance copy so I can have it read by the release and promote the hell out of it. But I don't know if you know this, but it's the first. I
know the author. I can hook you up.
Well, it's the first book to chronicle the unprecedented role of so many in government who were forced to play and the consequences of their actions during the Trump administration. You talked to Alexander Vindman and his brother, Ambassador Yovanovitch, Bill Taylor, Fiona Hill, Miles Taylor, who called himself anonymous, and as you mentioned, at least 90 more people. I can't wait to get this book, Dave.
Well, me too. I can't wait to get it in my hands, but it's done now. And it's a good book. And I talked to a lot of people from the cabinet level on down and on the record, off the record, and at great length. And it was fascinating and frightening, because I guarantee you'll read the book and you will come away saying, as bad as Trump was, we dodged a bullet.
Yeah. I think we, to some extent, know that, but we'll know it a lot more specifically. And who those people were that stood up in one way or another somehow. Dave, thank you. Thank you very much.
Always enjoy it.
All right. There you go. At DJ Rothkopf on Twitter. Read his columns at The Daily Beast. Listen to his series of podcasts at the Deep State Radio, the Rothkopf Group, Media Empire, and get that new book. He's the king of all media, really. I say that about a lot of people. That was great. I love talking to Dave. Makes me laugh. We talked for a while after as well. Super smart guy, and I really appreciate his time and joining me. So there you go, Dave Rothkopf. I learn a lot from him, his perspective. It sounds pretty dark and dreary in a lot of ways. I understand that you probably feel that way, and we're going to have to figure it out together. We're going to have to stay close and talk and communicate and share ideas and solutions and network, and I look forward to doing that with you each and every day here on Stand Up and our Discord chat, as well as our community hangout, which I invite you to join if you never have. Thursdays at 8 Eastern. Always a lot of fun. But now it's time to have more fun with Robbie Jones. I mentioned earlier, Robbie is president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. He's written a couple of very important books, most recently, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. He was just on the Joy Reid Show, The Readout, last night on MSNBC. He is in tremendous demand these days because he's got a PhD in religion, and he's formerly a Baptist himself. He grew up very religious in Mississippi, and his whole life story is fascinating, and you gotta get his books and read his stuff. Subscribe to his Substack as well. robertpjones.substack.com. All right, here we go with Dr. Jones. Robbie, welcome back.
Thanks, Pete. I'm glad to be back with you.
Yeah, lots to discuss. I wanted to reach out to talk to you about the latest developments in our country, I suppose, culturally, but specifically as they relate to the Supreme Court decisions, as they relate to even the January 6 hearings, but as they relate to history, too. I mean, you are the guy for so many reasons to talk about what's happening in our country. So, before I hit record, I asked you, the small talk question, how are you doing? And you said, been trying to figure out how to appropriately answer that for about 5 years. And it seems like we're talking both about Trump and the pandemic. But as it relates to your work, what is the issue, or issues that you grapple with the most to try to understand how we're doing?
Yeah. Well, you already mentioned the word history. And I feel like, this has been at the crux of it, this big question of who we are, who have we been, who are we are, and who are we going to be, right, are the big underlying questions that are getting answered, I would say, in some fairly disturbing ways by the Supreme Court, by our last president, and his legacy on the court, and in ways that are just so out of step with where most of the country is.
When you think about the founding, which you've written a lot about, the founding fathers, their religiosity or lack of religion, think about these latest Supreme Court decisions on religion, and now the conversation, certainly that you've been leading, but now a lot more people are obviously starting to realize about the separation between church and state. How do you think about the origins and the history and how it should be seen by Americans today?
Yeah. Well, I think we have, after all, the First Amendment, right? As in, we say that word, we don't really think about it, but it is the First Amendment, like really is the first one that people thought to put, established, this idea that the state and the church should be separate, in the country. And that idea has gone through a lot of evolution in the country. But I think one of the more disturbing things, that I've seen is that, I think as a country, we've been living into this idea of being, a pluralistic, multi-religious country, trying to put all religions on equal footing before the law. And we've really been lurched back at least 50 years in this latest Supreme Court ruling that is clearly favoring a Christian prayer. For example, in the Bremerton case, this high school football coach praying at the 50-yard line is favoring a kind of Christian prayer by a state employee, while on the job.
How do you see that? How obvious is that to you as an infringement of that separation between church and state when it comes to public schools and prayer?
Yeah. What's most troubling, I think, is that there is this, this reference by the Supreme Court to history and tradition, and they just ran roughshod over 50 years of jurisprudence at least that's been. So like there was this thing called the Lemon Test that that the court would consider when considering whether or not state actions were infringing on the establishment of religion. And it had things like it needs to serve, whatever the state action is, it needs to serve a secular purpose, right? Other kinds of principles like that this court just summarily dismissed and just went, right past it, and instead substituted this made up thing called a history and tradition test. And it basically means that, if the country has a longstanding tradition of doing something, then it like prayers in public schools, it deserves less scrutiny. And that really is, at least a half a century, lurch back from where the law has generally moved in this space. So it's pretty dramatic. I think it hasn't really sunk in to folks. And because it's history and tradition, and in this country, the majority religion has been Christianity, it means this is not a religious liberty issue, right? This is a Christian privilege issue, right? It actually puts Christianity ahead of every other religion. So, for example, if this had been, instead of Christian coach Kennedy, if it had been Hindu coach Patel, this case would have never been brought, and it certainly wouldn't have been argued on the basis of history and tradition.
Yeah, that's, I think, the most important part of this. You, of course, wrote the book, White Too Long, the end of white Christian America. You kind of answered my question there, making that point. It would be interesting to see someone of the Sikh religion bring a similar case and see how this court decides it. But when you think of Christianity in America, you also, unfortunately now, think of white supremacy, I think. The two are tied to a certain extent, and it would seem to be more prevalent now in 2022 than even when we were growing up or even when you were growing up in the church, Robbie. Fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, and I think it really is because of where we are in the country. I think it's clear that, because the country is changing. So, up until really the last, 20 years, the country was securely, demographically speaking, a majority white Christian country. And it was during Barack Obama's presidency that the population crossed this threshold from being a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer a majority white Christian country. Today, the country is only 44% white and Christian. That's never been true for any other generation. So I think this kind of freak out moment, this backlash moment that we're seeing is very much because of that, right? That in fact, people could provide lip service to religious liberty, to the Establishment Clause, knowing that so white Christians could provide lip service, knowing that they still were in the cultural and demographic majority. But today, they are no longer the cultural demographic majority. So I think there is this kind of now bald, reach for power to kind of preserve what's no longer there in the culture.
You have this great piece that you re-upped this year titled, "Let's Celebrate This 4th of July Without the Myth of White Christian Innocence." And you put it in your Substack, which is great. I'm a subscriber, robertpjones.substack.com. Everybody should subscribe. His unique take on these things is so important. But in this, you write a little bit about the kind of the backlash. You write, "We've seen Black Lives Matter countered by Blue Lives Matter, the 1619 Project rebutted by Donald Trump's 1776 Project, the successful removal of 160 Confederate monuments nationwide in 2020 answered with coordinated, fanatical denunciations of critical race theory by white evangelical and Republican leaders." I mean, you spell it out so perfectly there, just some of the reactions to people, to what I would call progress. And it's not going to end anytime soon. Where does it come from? What is fueling it?
Yeah, well, I think it is this challenge to, the story we tell about ourselves. The where we begin the story really matters. That's why the 1619 Project made such an impact. If you tell the American story from the perspective of the first enslaved people coming to these shores, that gives you a very different narrative. We're all used to the once upon a time, beginning to stories, but I think what we're often not conscious of is that, the once upon a time sets the stage for what can count as happily ever after, right at the end of the story.
That's for damn sure. I wanted to ask you about the Dobbs case, Roe v. Wade being overturned. How have you interpreted that? Surprised at all by that? I mean, even after the leaked draft came out?
Well, surprised in May when the leaked draft came out, but certainly not surprised after that.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing to say about this is, again, how out of step this ruling is with American public opinion. So, for example, we just put out a poll today, actually, at PRI that we dropped in the field right after the Dobbs decision. I mean, it is just remarkable when you look at, the country that, in the country today, it is like 2/3 of the country that says that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. I mean, that is, remarkable given where this court went. And, if you look at, it's just really Republicans who are only 35% in support of the legality, independents 65%, Democrats 88%. And even if you look in the religious realm, I mean, I think the most interesting chart we have on this is actually on religion, where you can just see the only religious group that is like strongly opposed to the legality of abortion are white evangelical Protestants. They make up 14% of the population. That's it, right? And yet that view, that religious view, is the one that's being upheld by this court. And a lot of people have made a big deal about the sort of the Catholic identity of the court, and that it's falling in line with kind of the Catholic hierarchy view on abortion, but all Catholics are. So white Catholics in our latest poll, 64% support the legality of abortion. And among Hispanic Catholics, it's 75% support the legality of abortion. So that's not, where the court is and where the church official position is nowhere near where rank and file Catholics are. It really is only white evangelicals in the religious world. So it's not a religious versus secular argument at all. It really is a white evangelical Republican, grab for power that's holding the rest of the country hostage on this issue.
Do you see any backlash to it?
I do think that there may be a way in which they've overplayed their hand here. I've thought about this a lot, that one of the things that Roe v. Wade being fairly secure until recently did is it created this space where there was a kind of morality play being played out on the right, where they could sort of hold these extremes and say, no exceptions, abortion should be illegal across the board. And know that they were not actually going to be called to account for the consequences of that stand as long as Roe was in place. But now, of course, they are. So we're going to actually see what happens in states like my home state of Mississippi that has effectively banned all abortions in the state. And, when we start seeing women die, when we start seeing 13, 14-year-olds being forced to carry pregnancies to term, on the basis after being raped, or being raped by even a relative. I think the real consequences of such an extreme stand are going to come to bear. And we should remember too that there's very little actual support for those extreme positions. It's only about 10-12% of the country that supports that says that abortion should be illegal in all cases. And in fact, there's no state in the country where you can get more than a quarter of the residents of that state supporting a total abortion ban.
Just such overwhelming statistics and majority views on this. And when you break it down like that, it's just even harder to swallow. But, were you surprised by this Rolling Stone reporting that the Supreme Court justices were praying with, who were these people that they were praying with before they overturned Roe v. Wade? Activists. A right-wing evangelical activist was caught on tape bragging that she prayed with the Supreme Court justices. The court's majority cited a legal brief that her group filed while overturning Roe v. Wade. Rolling Stone got this big scoop yesterday. I feel like there's a lot of people who have been following this, certainly you, who are not surprised to hear about this. Were you? I do say I'm over being surprised, but no, I was even surprised by that. Just the audacity of that and the impropriety of that is just stunning. That before they're going to rule on something that is going to affect the lives of all Americans, and again, this is evangelical activists. That's a group that represents 14.5% of the population, right? And this ruling is going to affect everyone, but to kind of privilege that group. And one of the things about prayer is that it's a fairly intimate act, right? And the reason people pray together is it builds community, it builds solidarity. And so there's a way in which praying with Supreme Court justices is probably a more powerful mode of persuasion than even having a conversation with them or leaving materials behind or any of those all of which would have been inappropriate. But I think in this case, in particular, this very intimate act of praying with someone, invoking the divine, right, before someone who has so much power over the state. And again, it's evangelical activists. This is a group that's 14.5% of the population inserting undue influence right before the court has to rule over something that affects everyone. Your group, PRRI, and everybody should follow them on Twitter because they always have this great polling at PRRI poll, tweets. Now, you're the president of the group, co-founder and now president. You tweet nearly 6 in 10 white Republicans, that's 58%, 54% of white evangelical Protestants, and 46% of white men report having guns in their homes or garages. These groups tend to be among those with the highest opposition to enact stricter gun controls. I certainly wanted to ask you about the horrific shooting on July 4th and all of the rest that seemed to be happening every day. It seems like one of the most American things, uniquely American things. And of course, it's going to happen. I hate to say it, but on July 4th, not of course, but just so horrible. What do you make of those statistics when it comes to religious folks, for sure? Wow.
Yeah, it is, I think, kind of remarkable. You think about people like Lauren Boebert sending out Christmas cards with their families with their, AR-15, rifles, and kind of mixing the birth of the Savior with assault rifles, those kinds of things. I do think it's deeply, deeply troubling. And I think I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'm really not prone to kind of, buy into, things where you have to string a lot of dots together. But I do think it's really troubling that we're seeing, a number of Americans tell us on surveys today, for example, that they are increasingly believing that political violence is justified, right, against their political enemies. And when those people are, not just speaking metaphorically, but are in fact armed, it becomes a really dangerous situation. So I'm deeply worried about it. The way that I was born in 1968, I'm in my mid 50s, and I've not been worried about the prospect of political violence in the country and in the way that I am today.
Yeah, no, you're certainly not alone. We're seeing it playing out far too often across the country in so many different ways. What are your thoughts about the midterm elections at this point, Robbie? How important do you see them? It seems like that a lot of people were kind of I feel like we've felt this way for the last several years, as you said earlier. And maybe this is the last, quote, Independence Day, and a lot of people writing and thinking about how, women just lost even more of what they had gained this Independence Day, and where are we at? And then the next step, of course, the next big thing is the midterm elections. What does it mean for local? I think we should talk about local elections as much as we should talk about, say, the House turning over to Republicans being run by someone like Jim Jordan or Magneto from Marvel.
Yeah, I do think these elections are going to be really crucial, both for the substance of what they produce, but also just for getting carried out in a way that people trust.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think there's been so much by Trump and Republican leadership, so much acceptance of this ridiculous, evidence-free, stop the steal, kind of rhetoric that they've kind of fallen in line with. I mean, the last polling we did on this, it was nearly 2/3 of Republicans who believed that the election had been stolen. Right. So that's a lot of, it's a kind of overwhelming majority of one of our two major political parties. So I think there's something critical about just these elections getting carried out. Well, there's also things like secretaries of state, right, who will be then presiding over 2024, and those kinds of things at the local level that will make a huge amount of difference. And state legislatures, too, like what laws they will pass and what kind of control they'll try to give themselves over the Electoral College for 2024, depending on what happens. So I think it's crucial, not just for the immediate substance, but for the integrity of future elections, particularly the presidential election in 2024.
And it would seem that with these Republicans coming in, when we talk about how they're becoming more extreme, one way to certainly describe that as a huge percentage of them are these white Christian extremists that are now in office. There's several that are already in office. They used to be a little bit more subtle about it. But now, I mean, they're very outspoken. And how many more of them are on the ballot? You've got somebody, like Mastriano running for governor in Pennsylvania, who was at the January 6th insurrection, which you've also written about. So much of the religious overtones, written so well about that. How much more of that do you see actually, the type of people that watch these extremist shows go to the insurrection and then actually run for office, whether it be the Board of Education, Secretary of State, or anywhere else? How much more of that are we seeing?
Yeah, you're right to point this out. I mean, I gave you the number on Republicans, but it's also 6 in 10 white evangelicals who believe the election was stolen, right? And I think what's wrapped up in all of this is this idea that the country, is designed to be a kind of promised land for European Christians, right? This white Christian America, and that it's being taken away from us. I mean, Trump talked about in that language all the time. And we are seeing more and more people talking that way, mimicking that language. The deep problem with that, of course, is that it evokes divine favor on one side of a political battle, and it turns the difference in saying we have political opponents and that we have mortal enemies are really big, right? And in a democracy, to function well, you can have political opponents, right, who you deeply disagree with, and you argue and you organize and you try to put them out of business and all of that. But if you lose, you just reorganize and try to live to fight another day. But if those people are your enemies and by fiat God's enemies, right, because God is on your side, that is, really the end of democracy, right? Because we're not just living somewhere we have political opponents, but where it's a fight between good and evil, this apocalyptic language. And, it's literally a fight to the death. And it also opens up the door for kind of any means necessary, right? If the ends are so important, like that God has to win and God is on your side,
right,
then the means to get there really start to cease to matter.
Yeah, hard to beat that with any kind of other strategy or vision, because we don't have a similar stakes, I guess. And most people, even those of us who would be affected directly, maybe not impacted so much. I'm talking about kind of affluent white progressives like me. We're not as likely to take action over this because we're doing okay. I have health insurance. My daughters are okay. I feel like we're just not as motivated. And I feel that way, especially right now, based on Roe v. Wade being overturned and what I wish was maybe a harsher reaction to it, or maybe I'm missing that.
One sort of maybe sign here that may help you on this front, that's the last poll that we just released today, actually shows for the first time ever that Democrats are saying that in the upcoming election that that a candidate who gets their support must share their view on abortion. There's now 43% of Democrats are now saying, yeah, no, I'm not going to vote for a candidate who doesn't share my view on abortion. And for the first time ever, there's more Democrats saying that than Republicans. Republicans have always been more willing to vote on that issue, but it's nearly doubled. It's gone from 23% to 43% among Democrats.
Well, I will hang my hat on that data point for today. I mean, I'll take it. I'll take whatever I can. All right, Robbie, listen, I just love talking to you. I love the work that your organization is doing. I love your Substack. I love your books. And I certainly appreciate you joining me here on the show whenever you do. We always learn a lot, and people love when you're here. So if they want to thank them, they should go subscribe to the Substack, support PRRI, and we'll talk to you again soon, man. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Always glad to be here.
There you go. Dr. Robbie Jones, Dave Rothkopf, and a little Pete Dominick putting it all together. Thank you for tuning in today, for pressing play, for subscribing, for a paid subscription. Go to standupwithpete.com or patreon.com/Pete Dominick. That's the service I use for subscriptions. Sign up now if you haven't. Thank you. And look for me and comedians Jay Black and Noel Kasler, if you're still listening, here on Tuesday, the 12th, for the January 6th committee hearings. We'll be together during the recess live on Twitter. I'll share that. And then after the hearings, I'll share that here on the show. Probably, I can't imagine why not, tomorrow or maybe earlier. So look for that. And that's it. That's all I've got for you. It's time to close with Stand Up, the song. You gotta stand up, the song written and performed by the great Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter John Carroll. JohnCarroll.org. Go buy the song. Take it away, John.
Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you gotta stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You gotta stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. a voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up,